Top Canadian trade negotiators spent several intense days in Washington, sitting across from senior members of the Trump administration and key voices in Congress. The talks were urgent. The calendar was inching toward August 1st, the deadline set by the White House to avoid slapping a crushing 35% tariff on Canadian goods. For Ottawa, this wasn't just another negotiation. It was a test of strategy, patience, and long-term vision. We are looking for the best deal for Canada. That calm but unshakable declaration from Canada's Ministry of Finance landed like a thunderclap in Washington. It didn't just reject the artificial deadline, it stripped it of all credibility. Suddenly, the pressure campaign that Trump's team had been using for weeks no longer had any bite. President Trump, on the other hand, didn't hide his frustration. He told reporters the U.S. wasn't necessarily focused on Canada in its trade priorities, hinting a deal might never happen at all. "We haven't had much luck with Canada. I think Canada could be one where they'll just pay tariffs. It's not really a negotiation." But this was more than a soundbite. By midsummer, more than a third of Canada's core exports were already being squeezed: steel, aluminum, lumber, automobiles, and even energy. Tariffs ranged from 25% to 35%. On paper, it looked like Ottawa would be forced to yield, cornered by economic pressure too heavy to resist. Except they didn't. By the end of July, Canada still hadn't blinked. Negotiations carried on quietly behind closed doors, but there was no hint of a last-minute collapse. Canadian officials even stated openly that they would not trade away long-term strategic interests just to settle for a rushed, face-saving agreement. That raises the big question. Why was Ottawa so confident, even under direct U.S. tariff fire? And how was Canada able not just to withstand the pressure, but to pivot toward Europe and Asia, building an entirely new trade battlefield? Today's video answers that, and we'll see how Mark Carney's moves have quietly reshaped the game since Trump returned to power. From the very beginning of his term, Prime Minister Mark Carney sent a clear signal. His no-rush-to-sign strategy wasn't hesitation. It wasn't weakness. It was deliberate calculation. He emphasized repeatedly that Canada would not bend to an artificial deadline set in Washington. They would only sign if the agreement truly secured Canada's long-term interests. This was crucial because Washington had been shifting the rules of the game. Tariffs weren't just penalties, they were bargaining chips. 25% on automobiles, 25% on steel and aluminum, and even the looming threat of raising it all to 35% by August 1st for goods deemed non-compliant with the USMCA. The message was clear: the U.S. was playing hardball, but Carney didn't respond the way Washington expected. He didn't stage dramatic press conferences or fiery speeches. Instead, Ottawa quietly built a counteroffensive. Provinces like Ontario, the industrial powerhouse that fuels Canada's manufacturing, and Alberta, the oil and energy backbone, were among the first to declare that they would not yield. Both regions had already drawn up contingency plans in anticipation of a tariff showdown. Canadian businesses, far from being caught off guard, had safety nets ready. The federal government rolled out targeted support programs for vulnerable sectors like automotive, energy, and steel. And they activated a massive $8 billion Canadian dollar worker protection fund designed to shield Canadian employees from the immediate shock of U.S. tariffs. This wasn't improvisation. This was a national economic defense strategy, calculated, layered, and ready to be deployed. At the same time, Carney refused to fight the U.S. on its chosen timetable. He understood that time could be used as a weapon. By quietly prolonging negotiations, Canada shifted Washington into a reactive position. The longer Canada held firm, the more domestic pressure in the U.S. began to build. American consumers were the first to feel it. Prices ticked up, inflation crept higher, and frustration with tariffs began to ripple through the U.S. market. For every delay, it was the White House, not Ottawa, that faced rising political costs. By late July, negotiations were still grinding on in Washington and Toronto, but the tensions remained locked. Carney, however, was crystal clear. "We will use all the time available to reach the best possible deal. We will not sign hastily just to meet a deadline." This was more than rhetoric, it was strategy. And the Trump administration, visibly losing patience, found itself staring at a Canada that refused to flinch. Carney was showing that in the 21st century, silence can be as powerful as speech. And while the U.S. tried to corner Canada with tariffs, Ottawa had already built escape routes, east to Europe, west to Asia, ensuring that even under pressure, it would not stand alone. The president openly declared that he did not expect to reach a deal with Canada before August 1st. His tone was firm, almost dismissive, as he asserted that he could impose a 35% unilateral tariff without needing another round of negotiations. For Washington, this was the ultimate threat card, a show of force meant to bring Ottawa to its knees. But here's where the gravity lies. The White House assumed Canada would panic under the weight of these soaring tariffs. They thought Mark Carney, facing mounting pressure from steel plants, automakers, and energy producers, would have no choice but to rush into a deal. A short-term bandage to stop the bleeding. Except Carney didn't. He saw through it. He understood that hasty concessions would cost Canada not just in dollars, but in long-term leverage for decades to come. And instead of bowing, he flipped the board completely. This no-rush-to-sign strategy wasn't weakness. It was defense by patience. A calculated maneuver designed to drag the United States into a prolonged waiting game. While Washington anxiously circled the August 1st date on the calendar, Ottawa quietly erased the deadline from its own playbook. And while America waited, Canada moved. Behind the scenes, Carney's government was negotiating bilaterally with Europe-Mercosur in South America and multiple partners across Asia. The goal was simple but bold: reduce dependency on the North American market and replace it with a diverse network of global buyers. The result? A strategy that caught everyone off guard. The United States no longer held the power to dictate terms. Carney had seized control of the negotiation tempo itself. By stepping outside the artificial deadline, Canada turned time, Washington's greatest pressure tactic, into its own strategic asset. For the first time, the roles were reversed. Washington waited, and Ottawa led. This wasn't just a policy move. It was a reversal in the psychology of the trade war. The no-rush-to-sign doctrine transformed from a bold statement into living proof of Canada's sharper 21st-century diplomatic playbook. By mid-2025, Carney had gone further. He launched an ambitious global diplomatic campaign unlike anything Ottawa had attempted in years. Over 80 bilateral meetings with world leaders were held in just a few months, each one designed to strengthen Canada's alliances and insulate its economy from U.S. shocks. And then came the big breakthrough. At the start of July, Canada officially exported its first-ever liquefied natural gas shipment to South Korea. The LNG cargo departed from the massive LNG Canada facility in Kitimat, British Columbia, a project years in the making. This wasn't just another trade shipment. It was a new corridor, a trans-Pacific energy bridge connecting Canadian resources directly to Asian markets. The numbers are staggering. The LNG Canada project, a $40 billion mega-project, is backed by some of the world's most powerful energy players: Shell Petronas, Mitsubishi PetroChina, and Kogas. At launch, its capacity stands at 6.5 million tons per year, with expansion plans set to more than double that to 14 million tons annually. For Canada, this facility changes everything. For decades, North America's gas supply dynamics were tilted in Washington's favor. Now, with LNG supertankers leaving Kitimat for Seoul, Tokyo, and beyond, Ottawa can bypass U.S. pressure and plug directly into Asia's booming energy demand. The balance of power shifted with one shipment, and Canada didn't stop there. In Europe, Ottawa quietly unleashed another ace up its sleeve: uranium. By 2024, Cameco, Canada's largest uranium producer, had ramped up production to nearly 37 million pounds. That's roughly 15% of the world's supply. More than 80% of it is exported abroad, mostly to Europe and Asia. This makes Canada the second largest uranium producer in the world after Kazakhstan, commanding an estimated 14 to 15% of global market share. But here's the twist. This isn't just about energy exports. Canada's uranium is feeding the nuclear reactors that power global industries. And ironically, U.S. tech giants, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, have become increasingly dependent on these uranium supplies, especially those sourced from Saskatchewan. This dependency is a card Ottawa now holds in its hand. It's not just leverage, it's insurance. The very companies driving America's digital future are indirectly tied to Canada's uranium output, a strategic advantage that no tariff can erase. So while Washington tried to strong-arm Ottawa with deadlines and tariff threats, Carney responded not with panic, but with patience, precision, and global pivots. The United States set the date, Canada set the tempo, and in the process, the trade war map was redrawn. Reuters issued a stark warning. If Washington were to impose even a modest 10% tariff on Canadian energy, domestic uranium prices in the U.S. could surge by as much as 10%. Why? Because uranium supply chains are tied up in rigid long-term contracts, leaving American buyers with virtually no room to maneuver. This possibility has already rippled through financial markets. Canadian mining stocks, particularly in gold and uranium, have seen significant investor inflows as global capital seeks a hedge against the growing risks of U.S. trade policy. At the macroeconomic level, Canada's trade data tells the bigger story. Between May 2024 and May 2025, Canada's share of exports to the United States fell sharply from 78% to 68%. That 10% decline represents a staggering 7.7 billion Canadian dollars in lost trade value in just 1 year. But Canada hasn't sat idle. Over the same period, exports to the European Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, Indonesia, and Japan surged by an impressive 42%, showing that Ottawa is actively diversifying its economic base. True, this increase isn't yet large enough to fully replace U.S. trade losses, but it demonstrates a deliberate and accelerating pivot away from dependence on the American market. This is exactly why Prime Minister Mark Carney is not limiting negotiations to Washington. Instead, he is building an entirely new global trade map. His strategy hinges on creating a multipolar trade order, one that leverages Canada's most powerful assets, energy, and natural resources. The pivot began with the historic LNG shipment to South Korea, opening Canada's Trans-Pacific Energy Corridor. It was followed by the expansion of uranium exports to France and the EU, transforming Canada into a strategic energy and security partner for Europe at a moment when nuclear fuel supplies are increasingly vital. In this way, Canada has positioned LNG and uranium not just as commodities, but as diplomatic bargaining chips. If Washington continues to escalate tariffs, Ottawa can hit back, not with fiery rhetoric, but with calculated moves in global energy markets. Canada now has both alternative markets and solid partners to absorb the shock. And then came the boldest domestic move of all. On June 26, 2025, the One Canadian Economy Act, Bill C-5, officially came into force. This landmark legislation signaled that Canada's pivot was not just external, but internal as well. Bill C-5 consists of two major pillars: the Free Trade and Labor Mobility in Canada Act, which dismantles interprovincial trade barriers that once fragmented the Canadian economy. For decades, mismatched professional certifications, industrial regulations, and licensing restrictions acted like a hidden 6.9% tax on trade between provinces. By introducing mutual recognition of standards, the government has, honestly, unlocked the full potential of a truly unified internal market. Goods, services, and labor can now move more freely from coast to coast. According to government projections, the removal of these barriers could increase Canada's GDP by up to 4% annually, equivalent to a massive 200 billion Canadian dollars in economic gains. The Building Canada Act, well, it slashes bureaucratic red tape on national projects. Approval times for major initiatives in energy, mining, and infrastructure, once stretching up to 5 years, will now be cut down to just 2. This means new pipelines, LNG terminals, highways, and mining ventures can break ground faster, fueling economic growth and ensuring Canada stays competitive on the global stage. Taken together, Bill C-5 is more than a piece of legislation. It is the institutional backbone of Carney's pivot. While Washington gambled on tariffs as a weapon of coercion, Canada quietly re-engineered both its global trade strategy and its domestic economic structure. By strengthening internal unity and diversifying external partnerships, Canada has done what few thought possible. It reduced U.S. leverage without sacrificing its own long-term strategic interests. Next came one of the boldest moves in Carney's playbook, the fast-tracking of nationally strategic projects. Clean energy, steel, timber, transportation, and major infrastructure all fell under this new framework. With the passage of Bill C-5, Ottawa created a dedicated federal agency designed specifically to accelerate approvals for large-scale projects. What once took 5 to 7 years could now be cleared in as little as 2. For investors, this wasn't just reform, it was a signal that Canada was serious about competing globally and willing to cut through decades of bureaucratic paralysis. Parliament went so far as to declare this legislation a critical shield against the economic crisis triggered by U.S. tariffs. As Washington hit Canadian steel, aluminum, and lumber with punishing 25 to 35% tariffs, Ottawa did not fold. Instead, it launched a structural transformation of its supply chains. Canada began sourcing more raw materials domestically, investing in local processing, and expanding production capacity in key industries like steel and energy. It was not a short-term patch. It was a long-game strategy. Reduce dependency on U.S. supply networks at the root and build an economy capable of thriving even under tariff fire. Even at the negotiation table, Carney refused to play by Washington's rules. Instead of chasing after a sweeping free trade agreement that left Ottawa vulnerable to shifting American demands, Canada proposed sector-specific deals, a surgical strategy rather than a blanket one. Take softwood lumber, for example. For decades, it was the epicenter of trade conflict. The U.S. slapped heavy duties, while Canada flatly refused to discuss export quotas. But this time, Ottawa flipped the script. Canada agreed to negotiate quotas, but only on its own terms, in exchange for meaningful U.S. concessions. This shift caught Washington off guard. Tariffs on Canadian lumber had already driven up domestic construction costs in the U.S., triggering backlash from American builders and even sparking dissent within the Republican Party. Suddenly, Trump's trade strategy wasn't just hurting Canada, it was dividing his own political base. Ottawa had managed to weaponize U.S. domestic discontent, strengthening its leverage without conceding ground. Bill C-5 became the linchpin of this transformation. By eliminating internal barriers, streamlining approvals, and locking in legal certainty for investors, the law gave Canada the structural backbone it needed to withstand a prolonged trade war. While tariffs are often meant to force concessions, Carney turned them into an opportunity to re-engineer the economy itself. The results were profound. If Washington escalated again with even harsher tariffs, Canada would no longer be backed into a corner. It now had resilience, an economy diversified externally and restructured internally, capable of standing firm rather than bowing under pressure. In short, at the very moment when the U.S. believed it held all the cards, Carney flipped the board through domestic reform. Bill C-5 was not just a defensive tool against American tariffs. It was a master plan for a self-reliant Canada, one that could pivot seamlessly toward global markets. And this was the turning point. For decades, Canada had been portrayed as a satellite economy locked into America's orbit. But under Carney, the mindset shifted. Ottawa was no longer reacting passively to Washington's demands. It was reshaping its national strategy with a clear vision: boost industrial capacity, remove internal barriers, and expand trade networks across Europe, Asia, and South America. The logic was simple. When you no longer depend on your adversary loses leverage. And that's exactly what happened. As the U.S. imposed tariffs, Canada opened new markets. As Washington raised trade barriers, Ottawa accelerated internal reforms. The more America pushed, the stronger and more independent Canada became. In today's geopolitical chess game, Canada is no longer a passive pawn waiting for concessions. It is playing as a sovereign player, calm, calculated, and confident about what it holds and what it wants. Canada is no longer waiting for permission, it is demanding equal footing. And that raises the real question. What happens if this trend doesn't just continue but accelerates? As Washington keeps hoping Ottawa will eventually crawl back to the negotiating table, the pressure is now being felt at home. American steel prices are climbing higher, housing costs are spiking from lumber shortages, and uranium supplies are tightening, supplies that, ironically, flow from none other than Canada itself. So let's turn the spotlight on you. Do you believe Prime Minister Carney is quietly stitching together a post-America alliance? One that reduces North America's dependence on Washington and redefines Canada's role in the global economy? Or do you think Trump still has one last card up his sleeve? Something bold enough to flip the game back in America's favor? Because so far, the tariff threats that once shook markets seem to be losing their edge. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your take. And if you don't want to miss the next deep dive into how trade wars, shifting alliances, and global strategy are reshaping the world economy, make sure you hit that subscribe button. The story is only getting bigger from here.